The scent of smoke hung in the air as Mabel Cooper stood frozen at the edge of her property, watching flames consume everything she had ever known. It was 1875 in Yankton, Dakota Territory, and the life she had carefully built over 3 years of homesteading was disappearing before her eyes. Tears streaked clean lines through the soot on her face as she clutched the charred remains of a quilt to her chest. The fabric crumbled between her fingers, blackened edges flaking away like autumn leaves. That quilt had been the last thing her mother had ever made before succumbing to consumption back in Pennsylvania. Now it was gone just like everything else. "Madam," a deep voice startled her from behind. "You all right? I saw the smoke from a mile off." Mabel didn't turn. She couldn't bear to face a stranger in her moment of devastation. "Does it look like I'm all right?" Her voice cracked, heavy with exhaustion and grief. The stranger dismounted, boots crunching on the dry earth as he approached. He stopped a respectful distance away, tall frame casting a long shadow in the late afternoon light. "Name's Preston Reed. I've got a spread about 5 miles west of here." She finally turned, looking up at the man. He stood over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered with a weather-beaten face that spoke of years under the Dakota sun. His eyes were kind, though, blue as the summer sky and filled with genuine concern beneath the brim of his worn Stetson. "Mabel Cooper," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "This was my home." Preston's gaze swept over the smoldering ruins of the small homestead, the cabin reduced to charred timber, the small barn nothing but ash, and the modest chicken coop collapsed into itself. Only the stone well still stood, a testament to stubbornness amidst destruction. "What happened?" he asked gently. Mabel shook her head, clutching the ruined quilt tighter. "I was in town selling eggs and vegetables when I returned." She gestured helplessly at the devastation. "Lightning, maybe. There was a storm brewing when I left." A sob escaped her as she looked down at the quilt in her hands. "This was my mother's, the only thing I had left of her." Preston stepped closer, his expression softening as he noticed what she was holding. "You're crying over a burned quilt." It wasn't a question, but there was no judgment in his tone, only understanding. "It's more than just fabric," Mabel whispered. "It's all I had left of home." Preston nodded slowly, removing his hat and holding it against his chest in respect for her loss. "You'll make another when you're ready," he said quietly. "Not to replace this one, nothing ever could, but someday you'll stitch together something new, carrying all those memories into it." Mabel looked up at him, surprised by the unexpected depth in his words. Most men she'd encountered in the territory had little patience for sentimentality, especially over women's work like quilting. "You have somewhere to go tonight?" Preston asked, replacing his hat. "It'll be dark soon." Mabel glanced at the horizon where the sun was indeed beginning to sink. She hadn't thought that far ahead. In the 3 hours since she'd discovered the fire, she'd been moving through a fog of disbelief. "I suppose I could ask the Wilkinsons if I could stay in their barn," she said, referring to a family whose homestead lay about 2 miles east, "or return to town." Preston frowned. "Town's a long walk, and the Wilkinsons went to visit relatives in Sioux Falls, won't be back for a fortnight." He hesitated, then added, "My sister lives with me. You'd be welcome to stay until you figure things out." Mabel stiffened. "I couldn't impose." "It's not imposing when it's offered freely," Preston countered. "Besides, Hannah would never forgive me if I left a neighbor in need." Mabel hesitated, weighing her limited options. She had no family in the territory, having come west after her parents' deaths to claim land under the Homestead Act. The few dollars in her pocket wouldn't stretch to more than a night at the boarding house in town. "Just until I can make other arrangements," she finally agreed. Preston nodded, seeming relieved. "You have anything else you want to salvage?" Mabel looked around helplessly. "There's nothing left to salvage." "Then we'd better get going before dark." He led his horse over, a sturdy palomino with intelligent eyes. "This is Rusty. He can carry us both, if you don't mind." Mabel had never ridden double with a man before, but these were desperate times. She carefully folded what remained of the quilt and tucked it into her apron pocket, the smallest piece she could keep. Then she allowed Preston to help her onto the horse before he swung up behind her. The ride to Preston's ranch was mostly silent, save for the rhythmic hoofbeats and the occasional comment from Preston pointing out landmarks. Mabel was acutely aware of his presence behind her, his chest solid and warm against her back as they rode. It had been a long time since she'd been this close to a man. By the time they crested the final hill, the sun was setting in earnest, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds. Below them sprawled a modest but well-kept ranch. A two-story house with a wide porch, a large barn with corrals, and several outbuildings. "It's not much," Preston said, a note of pride in his voice nonetheless, "but it's home." As they approached, a woman emerged from the house, wiping her hands on an apron. She was younger than Preston by several years, with the same blue eyes but lighter hair pulled back in a practical bun. "Preston Reed, what have you gone and done now?" She called out, though her tone was more curious than accusatory. Preston dismounted first, then helped Mabel down. "Hannah, this is Miss Mabel Cooper. Her homestead burned down today. She'll be staying with us for a spell." Hannah's expression immediately softened with sympathy. "Oh, you poor dear. Come inside right away. I've just finished supper and you look like you could use a hot meal." The warmth of Hannah's welcome nearly undid Mabel. After holding herself together through hours of shock and grief, this simple kindness threatened to break the dam of her emotions. "Thank you," she managed, forcing back tears. The inside of the Reed home was modest but comfortable, with solid furniture and touches that spoke of a woman's hand: curtains at the windows, a braided rug on the floor, and wildflowers in a jar on the table. "Sit, sit," Hannah urged, ushering Mabel to the table. "I'll fetch you some water to wash up, and then we'll eat." Preston hung his hat on a peg by the door. "I'll see to Rusty and be back directly." Left alone with Hannah, Mabel found herself relaxing slightly. There was something about the younger woman that inspired confidence. "Preston said your place burned?" Hannah asked gently as she poured water from a pitcher into a basin. Mabel nodded, accepting the offered cloth to wash her face and hands. "Everything's gone. 3 years of work just gone." Hannah's expression was sympathetic but practical. "Well, you're alive, and that's what matters most. Things can be rebuilt." "I don't know if I have the strength to start over again," Mabel admitted. Hannah squeezed her shoulder. "You don't have to decide tonight. Rest, eat, and tomorrow will look brighter." When Preston returned, they ate a simple but hearty supper of rabbit stew, cornbread, and preserved peaches. The food revived Mabel somewhat, though exhaustion still pulled at her like an undertow. After the meal, Hannah showed her to a small bedroom upstairs. "It's not much, but it's clean. I put out one of my nightgowns for you. We seem about the same size." "You're very kind," Mabel said, her voice thick with emotion. "Both of you," Hannah smiled. "That's what neighbors do out here. Without each other, none of us would survive." She hesitated, then added, "Preston may seem gruff, but he has a good heart. Lost his wife and baby to fever 5 years back before we moved here from Missouri. He doesn't talk about it much, but I think that's why he couldn't just ride past when he saw your place burning." The revelation gave Mabel a new perspective on the quiet cowboy who had come to her aid. "I'm sorry for his loss." "Life goes on," Hannah said simply. "Sleep well, Miss Cooper." "Mabel, please." "Mabel, then. Good night." Left alone, Mabel changed into the borrowed nightgown, washed as best she could with the basin of water Hannah had provided, and then sat on the edge of the bed. From her apron pocket, she withdrew the charred remains of her mother's quilt, just a small square, really, with one corner still showing the distinctive blue and white pattern her mother had favored. "You'll make another when you're ready," Preston had said. The thought seemed impossible now, with grief still raw and her future uncertain. But as she carefully placed the fragment on the bedside table and slipped between clean sheets, Mabel found herself wondering if perhaps, someday, he might be right. Morning arrived with the crowing of a rooster and the smell of coffee wafting up the stairs. Mabel woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day came rushing back. The loss hit her anew, a physical ache in her chest. She dressed quickly in yesterday's soot-stained clothes, the only ones she now possessed, and made her way downstairs. Hannah was at the stove, frying eggs and bacon, while Preston sat at the table reading a newspaper. "Good morning," Hannah greeted cheerfully. How did you sleep?" "Better than I expected," Mabel admitted. It was true exhaustion had claimed her quickly, granting merciful oblivion for a few hours. Preston folded his newspaper and nodded a greeting. "Thought we might ride into town today. You'll need supplies." "I have very little money," Mabel confessed, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "Just what I had with me when I went to market yesterday." "We can arrange something with Mr. Dawson at the Mercantile," Preston said. "He knows you're good for it." "I won't accept charity," Mabel said firmly, pride stiffening her spine despite everything. Preston's expression remained impassive. "Not offering charity, just neighborly help. You do the same." Before Mabel could argue further, Hannah set plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits on the table. "Eat first, plan later. Everything looks better with a full stomach." The meal was delicious, and Mabel realized she was ravenous. As they ate, Hannah filled the silence with cheerful chatter about the chickens' laying habits and her plans for the garden, requiring little response from Mabel. After breakfast, Preston excused himself to hitch the wagon while Hannah insisted on lending Mabel a clean dress. "I can't take your clothes," Mabel protested. "You can and you will," Hannah replied firmly. "It's only temporary, and I won't have you going to town looking like you've been cleaning chimneys." The dress, a practical brown calico with minimal trim, fit well enough, though it was a bit loose in the waist and too short at the ankles. Still, it was clean and whole, which was more than Mabel could say for her own garment. The ride to Yankton took nearly an hour. The town had grown significantly in recent years, especially since becoming the territorial capital. Wooden buildings lined the main street, with businesses ranging from the Mercantile to a hotel, a bank, and several saloons. Their first stop was the Mercantile, where Mr. Dawson, a portly man with spectacles perched on his nose, greeted them warmly until he heard of Mabel's misfortune. "My word, Miss Cooper, what a terrible thing to happen," he exclaimed. "You must take whatever you need to get back on your feet. We can settle accounts when your next crop comes in." Mabel was touched but determined to maintain her independence. "I'll take only what's absolutely necessary, Mr. Dawson, and I insist on paying for it as soon as I'm able." Under Preston's watchful eye, she selected the bare essentials: a change of clothing, basic toiletries, a comb, and a small sewing kit. When Preston added blankets, cooking utensils, and a week's worth of food staples to her modest pile, she started to object. "You can't rebuild a life with just a hairbrush and a clean shirt," he said quietly, his voice leaving no room for argument. Next, they visited the land office, where Mabel confirmed that her homestead claim remained valid despite the destruction of her dwelling. She would have to rebuild within a reasonable time frame to maintain ownership. "I'll start looking for work immediately," she told Preston as they left the office. "Perhaps Mrs. Harrington at the hotel needs help with laundry, or the dressmaker might want an assistant," Preston frowned. "And when would you rebuild?" "You need to focus on getting your place back in order before winter comes." "I can't do that without money," Mabel pointed out, frustration evident in her voice. "What if?" Preston hesitated, then continued, "What if I proposed a temporary arrangement? I need help with the house and garden." "Hannah does what she can, but she's been poorly since last winter's pneumonia. You could stay with us, help out, and in exchange, I'll provide materials and help with rebuilding your place." Mabel stopped walking, studying his face for any sign of ulterior motives. She found none, just open honesty and perhaps a hint of hope. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" she asked. Preston adjusted his hat, looking uncomfortable with the direct question. "Like I said, I need the help, and out here neighbors look after each other. That's how we all survive." There was more to it than that, Mabel suspected, but she couldn't deny the practicality of his offer. With her options limited and winter only months away, refusing would be foolish pride. "Very well," she agreed finally, "but only until my place is rebuilt. And I want everything accounted for, every board, every nail, so I can repay you properly." A ghost of a smile touched Preston's lips. "If you insist, Miss Cooper." They completed their business in town, including a stop at the sheriff's office to report the fire officially. By mid-afternoon, they were headed back to the Reed Ranch, the wagon loaded with supplies. You made a sensible decision, Preston said after they had traveled in silence for some time. Winter comes early in the territory, trying to rebuild alone before the first snow would be nearly impossible. I'm not accustomed to accepting help, Mabel admitted. After my parents died, I learned to rely on myself. There's strength in independence, Preston agreed, but there's wisdom in knowing when to accept a helping hand. Mabel glanced at him, struck by the insight. This quiet cowboy continued to surprise her. Your sister mentioned you lost your wife, she said softly, immediately regretting the personal question when she saw his jaw tighten. I apologize. That was presumptuous of me. Preston was silent for so long that Mabel thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured. Elizabeth and our son, Thomas. Fever took them both in 70. Thomas was only 6 months old. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. Sometimes I think I hear her laugh in the house. Ridiculous, I know. Not ridiculous, Mabel said gently. I still look for my mother sometimes, even though she's been gone 5 years now. Preston nodded, seeming relieved that she understood. Hannah came to live with me after. She gave up a teaching position in St. Louis to help me get back on my feet. I'd have lost everything without her. She seems like a remarkable woman. She is, Preston agreed, too good for this rough country. She should be married with children of her own by now, not playing nursemaid to her brooding brother. Mabel smiled despite herself. Is that how you see yourself, a brooding brother? The corner of Preston's mouth quirked up. According to Hannah, I'm the most stubborn, irritating man in the Dakota Territory. She may not be wrong. The small moment of levity eased the tension between them, and by the time they reached the ranch, Mabel felt more comfortable with her decision to accept their help. The next few weeks established a new routine. Mabel rose early to help Hannah with breakfast and the morning chores. She learned the rhythms of the Reed household when Preston expected meals. Which days Hannah did laundry, how the garden was tended. In return, Preston made good on his promise. He rode out to Mabel's property with his ranch hand, Miguel, to assess what could be salvaged and what would be needed for rebuilding. They cleared the charred remains, salvaged the stone from the fireplace, and began cutting timber for a new cabin. Mabel insisted on helping whenever possible, riding out with Preston to work alongside him. Her hands, already calloused from years of homesteading, grew rougher still as she learned to strip bark from logs and mix mud for chinking. You're not what I expected, Preston commented one afternoon as they worked side by side. Mabel wiped sweat from her brow, leaving a streak of dirt. What did you expect? Most women who come west looking for land give up after the first hard winter, he said, hammering a wooden peg into place. They're not prepared for how difficult it is. Perhaps they didn't have enough to run from, Mabel replied, immediately regretting the revealing comment. Preston paused, studying her with those perceptive blue eyes. What were you running from, Mabel Cooper? It was the first time he'd used her first name, and it caught her by surprise. The usual things, memories, expectations, a future predetermined by others. And now, he asked quietly, Mabel looked around at the half-built cabin, the cleared land beyond. Now I'm running toward something instead. A life I've chosen for myself, Preston nodded, seeming to understand. That's worth fighting for. As summer progressed into early fall, Mabel found herself increasingly comfortable at the Reed Ranch. Hannah became the sister she'd never had, teaching her to make preserves from the garden's harvest and sharing stories in the evenings as they sewed or mended. Preston remained more reserved, but Mabel began to read his moods when he wanted conversation and when he preferred silence, which topics made him withdraw and which brought rare smiles to his weathered face. She learned he had a dry wit that emerged unexpectedly, and that despite his taciturn nature, he was unfailingly kind to both his sister and his ranch hands. She also noticed things she shouldn't. The breadth of his shoulders when he removed his coat at the end of a day's work, the grace with which he handled horses, the gentleness in his calloused hands when he helped her down from the wagon. These observations troubled her, for she had not come west seeking a husband, especially one still haunted by his past. One evening in late September, after a long day working on her cabin, Mabel sat on the Reeds' front porch mending one of Preston's shirts. The sunset painted the prairie in gold and amber, while a cool breeze promised the coming change of seasons. Preston emerged from the barn and crossed to the porch, removing his hat as he approached. "Cabin's coming along well," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "Another 2 weeks, weather permitting, and it'll be habitable." Mabel nodded, trying to ignore the twinge of something like regret at the thought of leaving the Reed ranch. "I can't thank you enough for all you've done." "No need for thanks between neighbors," Preston replied, his standard response whenever she expressed gratitude. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, Mabel's needle flashing in the fading light as she repaired a torn seam. "Hannah tells me you were a teacher back east," Preston said eventually. Mabel looked up, surprised. "Yes, for a few years after finishing school. It was expected of unmarried women in our town." "Did you enjoy it?" She considered the question honestly. "Parts of it." "I enjoyed the children and the books, but the constraints were difficult, always being watched, judged. A teacher must be above reproach in all things." "Is that why you came west, to escape the watching eyes?" Mabel set down her mending, choosing her words carefully. "Partly. After my parents died, there was a man, the school board president's son. He decided I would make a suitable wife." Preston's expression darkened. "He forced his attentions on you, not physically," Mabel clarified, "but he was persistent despite my lack of interest. His father made it clear that my continued employment depended on my receptiveness to his son's courtship." "So you left?" Mabel nodded. "I had a small inheritance from my parents, enough to start fresh somewhere far away where no one knew me or had expectations of me." She smiled wryly. "I wanted land of my own, answerable to no one but myself." "And now that land is a pile of ashes and half-built logs," Preston observed. "The land remains," Mabel corrected him. "The rest can be rebuilt." Preston studied her face in the dying light. "You're a remarkable woman, Mabel Cooper." The unexpected compliment warmed her more than it should have. "You're easily impressed, Preston Reed." His laugh was a rare, rich sound that made her heart skip. "Not at all. I'm actually quite discerning in my admiration." Before Mabel could respond to this statement, which bordered dangerously on flirtation, Hannah called them in for supper, ending the moment. That night, lying in bed, Mabel found herself replaying the conversation, wondering if she'd imagined the warmth in Preston's voice, the appreciation in his eyes. It had been so long since she'd thought of herself as anything but a homesteader, a survivor, that the idea of being seen as a woman desirable, admirable, was both thrilling and terrifying. "Don't be a fool," she whispered to herself in the darkness. "He's being kind, nothing more." But even as she tried to convince herself, Mabel knew something had shifted between them, subtle as a change in the wind before a storm. The next morning brought rain, postponing work on the cabin. Mabel helped Hannah with indoor chores while Preston tended to necessary repairs in the barn. By afternoon, the rain had settled into a steady downpour that drummed on the roof and turned the yard to mud. "Perfect weather for quilting," Hannah declared, bringing out a basket of fabric scraps. "I've been saving these bits from old clothes and flour sacks." Mabel's hand instinctively went to her apron pocket, where she still carried the small fragment of her mother's quilt. "I haven't quilted since my mother died." Hannah's expression softened with understanding. "Perhaps it's time to start again. Not to replace what you've lost, but to create something new." The echo of Preston's words from that first day caught Mabel by surprise. "Your brother said something similar." "Preston has his moments of wisdom," Hannah said with affectionate exasperation, "few and far between though they may be." Together, they sorted fabric, choosing complementary colors and patterns. Hannah provided clean muslin for backing and batting made from a worn woolen blanket. They worked companionably through the afternoon, cutting squares and piecing them together in a simple pattern. When Preston came in for supper, shaking rain from his coat, he paused at the sight of fabric spread across the table. "Making a quilt?" he asked, his eyes finding Mabel's. "Hannah suggested it," Mabel explained, feeling inexplicably shy under his gaze. "Good idea," he said simply. but the approval in his voice warmed her. Over the following days, whenever rain prevented work on the cabin, Mabel and Hannah continued with the quilt. It became a project that filled the evening hours as well, the two women stitching by lamplight while Preston Reed aloud from a book of Tennyson's poetry, a surprising preference that had delighted Mabel when she discovered it. As October arrived with its crisp mornings and golden light, the cabin neared completion. Preston and Miguel installed the last of the roof shingles while Mabel and Hannah chinked the final gaps between logs. A small iron stove, purchased secondhand from a family returning east, was installed in one corner. "It will be snug enough for winter," Preston declared, surveying their work. "Though you'll need to bank the north wall with extra soil for insulation when the cold truly sets in." Mabel ran her hand along the smooth, planed surface of the door frame. "It's more solid than my first cabin," she admitted. "I didn't know what I was doing then." "And now you're a regular carpenter," Preston teased, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "I had a good teacher," she replied, returning his smile. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken thoughts. Then Hannah called that she had prepared lunch, breaking the spell. As they ate their simple meal of bread, cheese, and apples in the shadow of the new cabin, Mabel realized how close she had come to feeling at home at the Reed Ranch. The thought of returning to her solitary existence brought an unexpected pang of loneliness. "I should be able to move in next week," she said, more to remind herself than inform the others. Hannah looked disappointed. "Must you hurry? Winter's still a ways off." "I've imposed on your hospitality long enough," Mabel insisted. "Besides, I need to prepare the garden for spring planting if I'm to have any crop next year." Preston said nothing, his expression unreadable as he focused on his food. His silence troubled Mabel more than any objection might have. The journey back to the Reed Ranch that afternoon was subdued. Mabel found herself memorizing the landscape, the way the sunlight filtered through the trees, the particular bend in the creek they crossed, the silhouette of the house against the sky. Soon, these would be merely neighboring landmarks rather than the boundaries of her daily life. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Preston finally broke his silence on the matter. "You don't have to leave, you know," he said quietly. "Not right away." Mabel kept her eyes on the horizon. "I can't stay forever, Preston. Why not?" The directness of the question startled her into looking at him. His expression was serious intent, because... She began, then faltered. The practical reasons seemed suddenly insufficient, because the cabin is nearly finished, because I need to establish my independence again, because you're afraid, Preston finished for her, indignation flared. "I am not afraid. I crossed half a continent alone to claim that land. I've faced blizzards and drought and now fire. What could possibly frighten me about staying here?" Preston's gaze never wavered. "The same thing that frightens me when I think about you leaving." The admission hung in the air between them, changing everything and nothing at once. "Preston," Mabel said softly, uncertain what should follow his name. Before she could find the words, the front door opened and Hannah stepped onto the porch. "There you are. I was wondering if you'd help me with the quilt, Mabel. I think it's ready for the final binding." The moment broken, Mabel rose, grateful for the interruption yet frustrated by it too. "Of course." As she followed Hannah inside, Mabel felt Preston's eyes on her back and knew that something momentous had been left unresolved between them. The quilt was indeed ready for its final stage. The top pattern, a variation of the traditional log cabin design, was complete, with squares arranged to create a striking visual effect. The backing had been attached, and now only the binding remained to finish the edges. As they worked, Hannah chatted about inconsequential matters, but Mabel sensed the younger woman was giving her space to think. The repetitive motion of the needle through fabric was soothing, allowing her mind to wander back to Preston's words. What had he meant? That he would miss her company? That he feared for her safety alone on her homestead? Or something deeper, something that mirrored the confusing emotions that had been growing in her own heart? By the time they finished for the evening, Mabel was no closer to answers, but she had made a decision. Tomorrow she would speak with Preston directly. No more dancing around the subject like cautious children. Morning brought clear skies and a sharp frost that silvered the grass. Mabel rose early, determined to find a private moment with Preston before the day's work began. She found him in the barn, saddling his horse for the morning rounds of the property. "Good morning," she said, pulling her shawl tighter against the chill. Preston looked up, surprise giving way to a cautious smile. "Morning, you're up early. I wanted to speak with you about yesterday." He nodded, his hands stilling on the saddle strap. "I was too forward. I apologize if I made you uncomfortable." "You didn't," Mabel assured him, "but I need to understand what you meant about being frightened." Preston exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cool air. "I meant that the thought of you leaving troubles me more than it should, perhaps." He met her eyes directly. "I've grown accustomed to your presence, Mabel. The house feels more alive with you in it." "Is that all?" she pressed, heart hammering, a muscle worked in his jaw. "No, that's not all." He took a step toward her. "I admire you, your courage, your determination, the way you face each day without complaint despite everything you've lost." Another step. "When I'm with you, I remember what it feels like to look forward to tomorrow." Mabel found herself unable to move, rooted to the spot by the intensity of his gaze, the weight of his words. "I haven't felt this way since Elizabeth," he continued, voice low. "I never expected to feel it again. It frightens me." "It frightens me too," Mabel admitted, finally giving voice to the emotions she'd been trying to suppress. "I came west to be independent, not to care for someone again." Preston was close enough now that she could see the flecks of gray in his beard, smell the clean scent of soap and leather that always accompanied him. "What are we to do about it then?" he asked softly. Mabel swallowed hard. "I don't know, it's all happened so quickly." "Has it?" Preston's smile was gentle. "It's been nearly 3 months, Mabel. We've built a cabin together, shared meals and stories, worked side by side through summer and into fall. I'd say we've had time enough to know our own minds." Put that way, it did seem less sudden. Still, Mabel hesitated. "What about my homestead? I've worked too hard to abandon it now." "I would never ask you to," Preston assured her. "Your independence is part of what I admire about you." He took a deep breath. "I'm not proposing marriage, Mabel, not yet. I'm just asking you not to rush back to solitude when there might be something worth exploring here." The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. "What do you suggest, then?" "Stay through winter," he proposed. "Help Hannah with the house. Help me with the accounts. I know you're better with figures than I am. Come spring, if you still wish to return to your homestead, I won't stand in your way." It was a reasonable suggestion, practical even. The winter months would be harsh, and facing them alone in a new cabin would be challenging. Staying at the Reed Ranch made sense, but it wasn't practicality that made Mabel's heart lift at the prospect. "All right," she agreed softly, "until spring." The smile that transformed Preston's face was worth any uncertainty. He reached for her hand, his touch warm and sure as he raised it to his lips in a gesture both old-fashioned and deeply affecting. "Thank you," he said simply. The sound of approaching footsteps announced Hannah's arrival, ending their private moment. But something had changed, a decision made, a path chosen. As fall deepened toward winter, life at the Reed Ranch settled into a comfortable routine. Mabel found her place within the household, taking over much of the cooking and helping Preston organize the ranch accounts, which had been neglected for too long. Her teaching background proved useful as she established a proper bookkeeping system that showed exactly where money was being spent and earned. "You've saved us a small fortune already," Preston remarked one evening as they reviewed the accounts together. "I had no idea we were spending so much on feed when we could grow more ourselves." Mabel smiled, pleased by his appreciation. "It's just a matter of seeing the patterns. Next year, with proper planning, you can increase the hayfields and reduce purchases by at least half." "Next year," Preston repeated, a question in his voice. Mabel looked down at the ledger, avoiding his eyes. They hadn't spoken directly about the future since that morning in the barn, though the understanding between them had grown through small moments, hands touching when passing dishes at dinner, conversations that stretched into the night, shared glances that communicated without words. I was speaking hypothetically, she said carefully. Preston closed the ledger, his hand covering hers. And if it wasn't hypothetical, if I asked you to stay not just through winter but beyond, Mabel's pulse quickened. Are you asking? I'm considering it, Preston admitted, a smile tugging at his lips. But I made a promise not to rush you, and I intend to keep it. The restraint he showed, respecting her need for independence and time, only deepened Mabel's growing feelings for him. Other men had tried to overwhelm her with their certainty, their demands. Preston offered choice instead. I appreciate that, she said softly. And I'm considering too. His smile broadened and he squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. Good, that's good. As November brought the first snows, Mabel and Hannah finished the quilt. It was a beautiful piece, the colors harmonizing in a pattern that drew the eye from edge to center and back again. It's too fine for my cabin, Mabel protested when Hannah insisted it was hers to keep. Nonsense, Hannah declared. Every home needs beauty, especially a new one. Besides, we made it together, it belongs with you. The quilt took pride of place in Mabel's room, spread across the bed where its colors brightened the space during the increasingly short winter days. Sometimes, before falling asleep, Mabel would run her fingers over the careful stitches, thinking of her mother's quilt and how far she had come since that devastating day. You'll make another when you're ready, Preston had said. And he had been right. With December came holiday preparations. The Reed Ranch had never celebrated Christmas elaborately, according to Hannah, but this year she was determined to make it special. With 3 of us, it's a proper family gathering, she insisted, directing Preston to bring in a small pine tree from the north section of their property. The word family gave Mabel pause. Was that what they were becoming? The thought was both thrilling and unsettling. They decorated the tree with paper stars, strings of dried berries, and a few precious glass ornaments that had belonged to Preston and Hannah's mother. Mabel contributed a popcorn garland, a tradition from her childhood in Pennsylvania. In the evenings, they made gifts in secret. Mabel sewed a new shirt for Preston from fabric ordered from the mercantile and embroidered handkerchiefs for Hannah. Her efforts were hidden whenever footsteps approached, leading to much teasing about mysterious activities. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, with sunlight sparkling on fresh snow. They exchanged gifts after breakfast, the shirt and handkerchiefs from Mabel, a hand-carved wooden box from Preston for each woman, and knitted scarves from Hannah. There's one more, Preston said, producing a small package wrapped in brown paper. For you, Mabel. Curious, she unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a journal bound in soft leather with her initials MC tooled into the cover. I thought you might want to write down your experiences, Preston explained, for those who come after you. The story of a woman brave enough to claim land and build a life of her own. The thoughtfulness of the gift brought tears to Mabel's eyes. It's perfect, she whispered. Thank you. Acting on impulse, she leaned forward and pressed a kiss to his cheek. His skin was warm beneath her lips, his beard softer than she'd imagined. When she pulled back, the look in his eyes nearly took her breath away, tender, surprised, and filled with something deeper that made her heart race. Hannah's discreet cough reminded them they weren't alone, and the moment passed. But throughout the day, Mabel felt Preston's gaze following her and found herself watching him in return, each glance building a silent conversation between them. That evening, after Hannah had retired, claiming exhaustion from the day's festivities, Mabel and Preston sat before the fireplace. The house was quiet save for the crackling of flames and the occasional creak of the settling structure. It was a good Christmas, Preston said, his voice low to avoid disturbing the peaceful atmosphere. The best I've had in years, Mabel agreed. Thank you for including me. Preston turned to face her more fully. You're not an outsider here, Mabel. I hope you know that by now. She nodded, watching the firelight play across his features. I'm beginning to. Silence stretched between them, comfortable yet charged with unspoken thoughts. I've been thinking, Preston began, then hesitated. A dangerous pastime, Mabel teased gently, echoing a joke between them. He smiled, acknowledging the reference. Indeed, but necessary. He took a deep breath. I've been thinking about spring and your return to your homestead. Mabel's heart sank slightly. Was he eager for her to leave after all? Yes, I don't want you to go, Preston said simply. I want to ask you to stay, permanently. The directness of his statement caught her off guard. Preston, please let me finish, he interrupted softly. I'm not asking you to abandon your land or your dreams. I'm asking if those dreams might have room for expansion. What are you suggesting? Mabel asked, though she thought she knew. Preston reached for her hand, his touch gentle but sure. I'm suggesting that two properties could be managed as one, that two lives could be joined without either being diminished. His blue eyes held her steadily. I'm asking if you might consider becoming my wife, Mabel Cooper. Though she had sensed the conversation was heading in this direction, hearing the actual proposal still sent a shock through Mabel. Marriage had been so far from her mind when she came west, a deliberate turning away from the path expected of women. Yet the idea of marriage to Preston, this quiet, thoughtful man who respected her independence and admired her strength, was nothing like the future she had rejected back east. You don't have to answer now, Preston added, misinterpreting her silence. I promised you until spring, and that promise stands. Mabel squeezed his hand. I don't need until spring, she said softly, not to know my own heart. Hope flickered in Preston's eyes. And what does your heart tell you? Instead of answering with words, Mabel leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened as Preston responded, his free hand coming up to cradle her cheek. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Mabel smiled. Does that answer your question? Most eloquently, Preston murmured, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. But to avoid any misunderstanding, I'd like to hear the words. Yes, Preston Reed, Mabel said clearly. I will marry you. His smile was like sunrise breaking across the prairie. You've made me the happiest man in the Dakota Territory. Happier than when that roan mare finally foaled last spring, Mabel teased, referring to an event Preston had described as the best day in recent memory. Preston laughed, the sound rich and full. Far happier, though it's a close competition. He pulled her close again, this kiss deeper and more confident than the first. Mabel felt herself responding with a passion she had scarcely acknowledged before, her hands finding their way to his shoulders, then his hair when they separated. Preston's eyes were dark with desire, but his touch remained respectful. We should probably continue this discussion after the wedding, he said, his voice husky. Mabel nodded, both disappointed and relieved by his restraint. When shall that be? How does April sound? After the worst of winter, but before spring planting demands all our attention. April is perfect, Mabel agreed. They talked well into the night, planning their future together. Preston's ranch would remain their primary residence, but Mabel's homestead would be developed as well perhaps as grazing land for expanding the herd, with the cabin maintained for use during calving season or as a place to retreat when either needed solitude. Your independence matters to me, Preston assured her. I don't want you to feel trapped or confined. And I don't want you to feel I'm ungrateful or distant if I sometimes need space, Mabel replied. Then we understand each other, Preston said, bringing her hand to his lips. A partnership of equals. When they finally said goodnight, Mabel climbed the stairs to her room feeling as though she were floating. Never had she imagined finding love in this wild territory, least of all with a man who understood her so completely. The news of their engagement was met with delight from Hannah, who confessed she had been hoping for this outcome since October. You two circled each other like cautious cats, she laughed. I was tempted to lock you in the root cellar until you sorted things out. Word spread quickly through the scattered community. Most reactions were positive, though Mabel noted a few raised eyebrows from those who perhaps thought Preston should have chosen someone with more property or connections. Pay them no mind, Hannah advised. Preston hasn't smiled this much since before Elizabeth died. Anyone with eyes can see you're good for him. The winter passed in a flurry of preparations. Mabel sewed her wedding dress from fine wool ordered from Yankton, with lace trim sent by Hannah's friend in St. Louis. Preston added a room to the house, working through the coldest days to have it ready by spring, a bright, south-facing space that would serve as their bedroom. February brought a week of blizzards that trapped them indoors. The forced confinement tested everyone's patience, but also provided time for deeper conversations. Preston shared stories of his childhood in Missouri, of meeting Elizabeth at a county fair when he was 20, and she just 17, of their dreams of a western ranch. "We were so young," he reflected one evening, "so certain everything would unfold exactly as we planned." "And now," Mabel asked softly. "Now I know life rarely follows our plans," he said, his expression thoughtful rather than bitter. "But sometimes it leads us to places we never imagined, yet exactly where we need to be." Mabel understood he was speaking of her, of them, and the unexpected joy they had found in each other. In March, they made a trip to Mabel's homestead to check on the cabin and begin preparations for spring. The structure had weathered the winter well, standing solid against the Dakota winds. Inside, Mabel laid out the quilt she and Hannah had made, smoothing it over the simple bed frame Preston had constructed. "It looks right here," Preston observed from the doorway. "Like it belongs." Mabel nodded, surveying the small but sturdy cabin. "It's a good home, different from what I first built, but stronger." Preston's arms encircled her from behind, his chin resting on her head. "Like you," he murmured, "forged by fire, rebuilt with greater wisdom." Mabel leaned back against him, savoring his warmth and strength. "I never thanked you properly, you know." "For what?" "For that day, when you found me crying over a burned quilt and said I'd make another when I was ready." She turned in his arms to face him. "You gave me hope when I had none." Preston's expression softened with memory. "I spoke from experience. After Elizabeth died, Hannah made me a new shirt from some of her old dresses. I was angry at first, thought she was trying to erase Elizabeth's memory, but she told me that making new things from old cloth is how we carry on. We don't forget the past, we weave it into our future." "Your sister is very wise," Mabel said. "Don't tell her I said so, but yes, she is." Preston kissed her forehead gently. "Come, we should head back before dark." As they rode away, Mabel looked back at the cabin, her first independent achievement in the territory. Soon, it would be just one part of a larger life, a chapter rather than the whole story. The thought brought no regret, only anticipation for the pages yet to be written. April arrived with warming temperatures and the first green shoots pushing through the soil. On the 15th of the month, a clear Saturday morning, Mabel Cooper became Mabel Reed in a ceremony held at the Reed Ranch. The gathering was small but joyful. Hannah, of course, Miguel and the other ranch hands, the minister from Yankton, and a handful of neighbors who had come to know and respect both Preston and Mabel over the past months. Standing before the minister in her wool dress with its lace collar, Mabel felt none of the apprehension she had once associated with marriage. Instead, looking into Preston's eyes as they exchanged vows, she felt only certainty that this man, this life, this choice was right. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "Mr. Reed, you may kiss your bride." Preston did so with enthusiasm, prompting good-natured cheers from the assembled guests. The celebration that followed was simple but heartfelt. Hannah had prepared a feast with help from neighboring women, and Miguel played the fiddle while others sang or danced. As afternoon turned to evening, guests gradually departed, leaving the newlyweds and Hannah to the quiet of the ranch. "I think I'll visit Mrs. Thornton tonight," Hannah announced with transparent subtlety. "She invited me for a quilting session, and it seems like a good evening for it." Preston thanked his sister with a hug, while Mabel blushed at the obvious arrangement. After Hannah's departure, a moment of shyness fell between them despite months of growing intimacy. They stood in the main room, suddenly awkward as new spouses sometimes are. "Would you like some tea?" Preston offered. Mabel laughed, breaking the tension. "Is that really what you want to ask your wife on your wedding night?" Preston's smile was slow and warm. "No," he admitted, "but I didn't want to presume." "Presume," Mabel invited softly. He needed no further encouragement. Crossing to her in 2 strides, Preston gathered her into his arms, his kiss deeper and more passionate than any they had shared before. Mabel responded in kind, her hands finding their way beneath his coat, exploring the solid warmth of him through his shirt. When he lifted her into his arms, she made no protest as he carried her to the new bedroom, their bedroom now, and laid her gently on the quilt-covered bed. The room was bathed in the golden light of sunset, casting a warm glow over everything. "You are so beautiful," Preston murmured, his eyes taking in every detail of her face. "As are you," Mabel replied, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw. What followed was a revelation for Mabel. Her limited understanding of marital relations had not prepared her for the tenderness and passion of Preston's lovemaking, nor for her own eager response. They discovered each other slowly, with wonder and occasional laughter when inexperience led to awkward moments quickly overcome. Afterward, lying in the circle of Preston's arms as twilight deepened into night, Mabel felt a profound sense of rightness. This was where she belonged, not just in this house or this bed, but with this man who had helped her rebuild more than just a cabin. "What are you thinking?" Preston asked, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "That I never expected to find this when I came west," Mabel answered honestly. "I was running away from the idea of marriage, of being dependent on anyone. And now I understand there's a difference between dependence and partnership." She propped herself up on one elbow to see his face. "You never asked me to be less than I am. You helped me become more." Preston tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch reverent. "And you brought life back to a house and a man that had forgotten how to do more than just survive." Their kiss sealed these truths between them, a promise of the future they would build together. Spring unfolded into a busy summer as they established their new rhythms as a married couple. Preston expanded the cattle operation, while Mabel divided her time between the ranch house and her homestead, where she planted a larger garden than before. Hannah, contrary to Preston's earlier concerns, seemed delighted with the arrangement, especially when a young widower with 2 small children moved onto a neighboring property and began calling regularly. "Daniel is just being neighborly," she insisted when Preston teased her about the frequent visits. "Of course," Preston agreed, winking at Mabel. "Just as I was being neighborly when I helped Mabel rebuild her cabin, by autumn, Mabel had news of her own to share." On a crisp October evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, a habit they had maintained since their courtship days, she took Preston's hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby," she said softly, watching his face. Preston's expression transformed from confusion to wonder to joy in the span of seconds. "A baby," he repeated, as if testing the word. "When?" "Late spring, according to my calculations. May, perhaps." Preston pulled her into his arms, his embrace gentle as if she had suddenly become fragile. "A baby," he said again, voice thick with emotion. She understood his inability to find words. Preston had lost a son once. The prospect of another child was both joyful and frightening. "We'll face it together," she assured him. "Whatever comes," he nodded against her hair. "Together." The pregnancy progressed well through the winter months. Mabel remained active, though she allowed Preston to take over some of the heavier chores she would normally have handled. Hannah was ecstatic about becoming an aunt again, and began knitting tiny garments almost immediately upon hearing the news. In December, Daniel proposed to Hannah, who accepted with a joy that mirrored Preston and Mabel's own happiness. They set a date for the following June, after Mabel's baby would have arrived. "This house will be quiet without you," Mabel told Hannah as they prepared Christmas dinner together. "But fuller in other ways," Hannah replied, nodding meaningfully at Mabel's growing belly. "Besides, we'll only be 3 miles away. I expect frequent visits." "You shall have them," Mabel promised. The new year, 1876, brought national excitement with the centennial celebrations, but on the Reed Ranch, all attention was focused on the approaching birth. Preston became increasingly protective, while Mabel struggled to balance his concern with her desire to maintain as much normalcy as possible. "I'm with child, not made of glass," she reminded him when he objected to her plans to ride to her homestead. "Humor me," Preston requested, offering a compromise of the wagon instead. Mabel agreed, recognizing that his worry stemmed from past loss rather than a desire to control her activities. May arrived with gentle warmth and prairie flowers in full bloom. On the 12th, as dawn broke over the eastern horizon, Mabel's labor began. The midwife was summoned from a nearby homestead while Preston paced the porch, barred from the bedroom by tradition and the midwife's firm instructions. After 6 hours that seemed an eternity to everyone involved, William Thomas Reed announced his arrival with a lusty cry that brought tears to his father's eyes when he was finally allowed to enter the room. "He's perfect," Preston whispered, cradling his son with a tenderness that made Mabel's heart swell. "Look what we've made, Mabel," she smiled tiredly, reaching out to touch the downy head of their child. "A new beginning." "Another quilt," Preston said softly, understanding in his eyes as he referred back to their first conversation. Mabel nodded. "Woven from threads of the past but made for the future." As William grew through his first summer and autumn, Mabel kept a careful record in the journal Preston had given her. Each milestone was documented: his first smile, his first tooth, the day he rolled over, and later when he began to crawl. Between these entries, she wrote about life on the ranch, about Hannah's wedding to Daniel, about the expanding herd and the new fields Preston had planted with wheat. Sometimes she wrote about the fire that had changed her life's direction, leading her to the Reeds and ultimately to a happiness she had never anticipated. The fragment of her mother's quilt was preserved between the pages of the journal, a reminder of what had been lost and what had been found. On the anniversary of the fire, Preston suggested they ride out to Mabel's homestead. William, now 7 months old, was secured in a special carrier Preston had designed that attached to the saddle, allowing Mabel to ride safely with her son. The cabin stood welcoming in the autumn sunlight, surrounded now by a thriving garden and small orchard of newly planted fruit trees. Inside, the quilt Mabel and Hannah had made brightened the simple space, which was used regularly when ranch work required overnight stays. "It's hard to believe it's been a year," Mabel said as they sat on the porch, William contentedly exploring a wooden toy in his mother's lap. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday," Preston agreed, his arm around her shoulders. "Other times it seems you've always been part of my life." Mabel leaned into him, savoring the solid strength of his presence. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't seen the smoke that day?" Preston considered the question. "I like to think we would have met eventually. Yankton isn't so large that we could have avoided each other forever." "Perhaps," Mabel smiled, "but would you have noticed me, just another homesteader in town for supplies?" "I would have noticed you," Preston said with certainty. "You're not a woman easily overlooked, Mabel Reed." She laughed softly. "You're biased, discerning," he corrected, echoing their long-ago conversation on the porch. "And grateful beyond words that fate or providence brought us together, whatever the circumstances." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they prepared to return to the main ranch. Mabel took one last look around the homestead, her first independent endeavor in the territory, now just one part of a much larger life. "Ready?" Preston asked, William already secured in his carrier on the saddle. Mabel nodded, taking his offered hand to mount her own horse. "Ready." They rode home together through the golden light of late afternoon, a family forged from separate stories now woven into one ongoing narrative. Behind them, the small cabin stood as a monument to resilience, to beginnings and endings, to the courage to build anew from ashes. And in their home on the Reed Ranch, draped over William's cradle, lay a new quilt Mabel had begun, small squares of fabric, each holding meaning. A piece of her wedding dress, a scrap from Preston's favorite old shirt, a bit of William's first blanket. Together they formed a pattern unique and beautiful, much like the life she had created from the ashes of loss. She was ready.